A rainy night, an empty building, a broken elevator, and two strangers in the dark. She, a virgin, carried the weight of a silenced childhood. He, a billionaire, hid traumas, secrets, and an obsession that spanned generations. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end and you won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. The rain beat against the bus windows with an intensity that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Leah's chest. It was almost midnight when she got off at the Park Avenue stop, adjusting the worn-out backpack on her shoulders and pulling up the hood of her coat to shield herself from the fine drizzle that insisted on falling over New York City. At 23, she had learned that the big city made no concessions for anyone, especially for a girl from rural Ohio who had arrived with only a whispered promise to herself: she would never be anyone's prisoner again. The Van Arden Group building rose before her like a giant of glass and steel, its 40 stories disappearing into the night fog. Leah had worked on the overnight cleaning crew for 6 months, and she still felt a knot in her stomach every time she walked through the main lobby, with its gleaming marble and chandeliers, worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. It was a world that wasn't hers, but it offered her something she had never had before: independence. As she greeted John, the night doorman, with a discreet nod, Leah couldn't imagine she was being watched. 40 stories above, in a luxurious penthouse that occupied the top 2 floors of the building, Edward Van Arden couldn't sleep. He never could. Since Helena's death 2 years earlier, sleep had become a distant stranger who rarely visited. Edward was 42 and commanded an empire that spread throughout the United States and North America. The Van Arden Group controlled everything from tech startups to coffee plantations in Costa Rica, along with real estate investments that shaped the New York skyline. But none of that mattered in the silent pre-dawn hours when he found himself staring at the security cameras that monitored every floor of the company, watching life unfold in the empty corridors. That was how he saw her for the first time. Leah cleaned the conference rooms with an almost obsessive meticulousness, wiping down every surface twice with alcohol, as if trying to purify not just the environment, but something within herself. She wore earbuds, barely hidden beneath her dark hair, and moved to the rhythm of a music only she could hear. Edward later discovered it was classical music, Chopin mainly, a peculiarity that intrigued him deeply. There was something in the way she moved, in the way her eyes would get lost in the city's night view through the windows, that awakened a morbid curiosity in Edward. It wasn't just her natural beauty, though she was unquestionably beautiful, with delicate features that contrasted with the determination in her gaze. It was more than that. It was as if she carried a familiar sadness, a kind of pain he recognized because he saw it reflected in his own mirror every morning. Edward began to investigate. He found out that Leah Oliver had been born in a small town in Ohio, an only child raised by her grandmother after her mother was committed to a psychiatric hospital when she was just 8. The grandmother, a religious and severe woman, had raised Leah with rigid discipline, instilling in her an almost pathological fear of men and intimacy. At 18, Leah had run away to New York with just a backpack and the certainty that she needed to build a life far from the shadows of her past. For months, Edward followed her routine through the cameras. He knew she always arrived 15 minutes early, that she avoided long conversations with her colleagues, that she ate lunch alone in the cafeteria reading books borrowed from the public library. He knew she sent half her salary to her grandmother every month, even after everything she had been through. This information touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Edward didn't fully understand his own obsession. Perhaps it was the fact that Leah reminded him of Helena at times, especially in the way she would get lost in thought when she believed she was alone. Or perhaps it was the exact opposite. Perhaps she represented everything Helena had never been: genuine, strong, a fighter. Helena had been born with a silver spoon, raised in a world of privilege that had made her fragile when the real storms of life arrived. Helena's death was still a mystery that consumed Edward. Officially, it was a suicide. She had thrown herself from the penthouse balcony on a stormy night, leaving only an incomprehensible letter talking about secrets and guilt that Edward could never decipher. But there were details that didn't add up, suspicions that kept him awake, questions that made him a ghost in his own life. It was Dr. Miles Spencer, the company psychiatrist who had treated Helena in her final months, who first suggested that Edward needed to move on. Miles was a man in his 50s, with greying hair always perfectly coiffed, who spoke with a disturbing calm and had a habit of observing people as if he were constantly analysing their behaviour. He maintained a private practice but also offered services to the Van Arden Group's employees, a partnership that had existed for over a decade. "You can't live forever trapped in the past, Edward," Miles would say during their mandatory monthly sessions. "Helena is gone. You need to find a way to reconnect with life." But Edward couldn't reconnect. He couldn't feel anything but a dull anger that ate at him from the inside, a guilt he couldn't name, and a loneliness that seemed to grow with each passing day. Until he started watching Leah. On that rainy Thursday in April, something changed. Edward was in his private office in the penthouse when he saw Leah standing before the window on the 36th floor, looking down at the city below. She had taken off her earbuds and her face was wet with tears. They weren't dramatic tears, but a silent, restrained weeping, as if she were afraid even of her own sadness. Edward found himself rising from his chair, walking to the private elevator, and descending to the floor where she was. He didn't plan what he would do. He simply found himself walking through the dark corridors until he found her, still standing before the window. "Is everything all right?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. Leah turned with a start, quickly wiping her face with her hands. She didn't recognize him. Edward was wearing casual clothes and lacked the formal posture he maintained during business hours. To her, he was just a well-dressed man who probably worked on one of the upper floors. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be standing here," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "I'll get back to work." "You don't need to apologize. Sometimes the city gets too heavy, doesn't it?" Leah studied him for a moment, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "Yeah, sometimes it does." "You like classical music," Edward said, noticing the earbuds hanging around her neck. "Chopin?" The astonishment in her eyes was genuine. "How did you—" "I like it too, especially the nocturnes. There's something about them that fits New York in the middle of the night." For the first time in months, Edward saw Leah smile. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. And in that moment, he knew he was lost. They talked for 20 minutes, standing there in the empty corridor, talking about music, about the city, about small things that somehow seemed enormous in that context. Edward discovered that she had learned to like classical music by chance when she found a forgotten CD on a bus years ago. Leah discovered that he knew more about the city than any tour guide, though he spoke about New York with a melancholy she recognized immediately. When she finally said she needed to get back to work, Edward didn't try to stop her. But something had changed between them. A connection had been established, delicate as a silk thread, but strong enough to leave them both unsettled in the days that followed. Edward returned to the penthouse knowing he had crossed a line. He could no longer be content with just watching Leah through the cameras. He wanted to know her, to understand what made her smile, to uncover the secrets behind the sadness she wore like a second skin. It was dangerous and irrational, especially considering the difference in social status between them, but for the first time since Helena's death, Edward felt truly alive. The next day, he instructed the Human Resources Department to re-evaluate Leah's duties. Nothing too obvious, just a discreet promotion that would have her working on the executive floors with a better salary and more flexible hours. When questioned about the criteria for the choice, Edward simply said he had observed the employee's exceptional dedication. Leah received the news with a mixture of joy and suspicion. Promotions like that didn't just happen, especially for people like her. But the extra money was a blessing she couldn't refuse, and the change in schedule meant she could finally enroll in the night business administration course she had been putting off for months. What she didn't know was that Edward had orchestrated every detail to create opportunities to meet her again. Meetings that ran late, documents that needed to be organized at specific times, small situations that put them in the same space at the same time. Over the following weeks, these encounters became the highlight of both their days. Conversations that began formally and evolved into whispered confessions in the empty hallways. Edward discovered that Leah dreamed of having her own company one day, that she voraciously read everything she could find about management and marketing, that she had a sharp intelligence hidden behind her shyness. Leah discovered that the mysterious man from the upper floors had a dry sense of humor, knew every detail of the company's history, and spoke about business with a passion she found fascinating. They still didn't know each other's real names. Edward had introduced himself simply as Ed, and she had never asked for his last name. To him, she was Leah, the girl with the earbuds and the borrowed books. To her, he was the man who made her feel smart, interesting, seen. But secrets have a life of their own, and it wasn't long before the truth began to seep through the cracks of the fantasy they had both built. Edward knew he couldn't keep up the charade indefinitely, and Leah, with her intuition sharpened by years of survival, began to sense there was more to Ed's story than he was telling. The first clue came when she saw him stepping out of the private elevator that gave direct access to the penthouse. It was late at night, and she was finishing up organizing some documents when the elevator doors opened, and Ed appeared, wearing an impeccable suit that cost more than her annual salary. He saw her before she could hide, and for a moment they both froze, aware that the game had changed. "Leah," he said, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before. Fear, perhaps, or regret. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Edward closed his eyes, knowing the moment of truth had arrived. When he opened them again, Leah saw a vulnerability in them that took her breath away. "My name is Edward Van Arden," he said, and watched as recognition spread across her face like a wave. "And I need to tell you a few things." The silence that followed Edward's revelation echoed through the corridor like a scream. Leah felt the floor shift beneath her feet, as if the entire reality she had known for the past few weeks had been built on quicksand. Edward Van Arden, the owner of all of this, the richest man in the country, according to the magazines, the tragic widower who had lost his wife under mysterious circumstances. "You lied to me," she whispered, and there was more pain than anger in her voice. Edward took a step forward, but Leah instinctively recoiled, and he stopped as if he'd been punched. "Not exactly. I just omitted some information." "Some information?" Leah's voice rose an octave, and she fought to keep it down. Even in her outrage, she was conscious that they were in the middle of his corporate building. "You're my boss. In fact, you're everyone's boss here. You have power over my job, my life, my future, and you thought that was just an irrelevant piece of information." "Leah, please let me explain this." "Explain what?" The words shot out of her like projectiles. "How you had fun playing with the humble employee. How funny it was to watch me act naturally while you knew exactly who I was, where I lived, how much I earned." Edward felt each word like a blade. "It wasn't like that. It was never like that." "Then what was it like?" Leah crossed her arms, a defensive posture he recognized. It was how she stood when she felt cornered. "Explain to me how a billionaire decides to approach a cleaning lady without it being about power. Explain how this isn't about you being bored with your privileged life and deciding to play with someone who has no choice." Leah's words found their target with surgical precision. Edward had grown up in a world where people told him what he wanted to hear, where his desires were anticipated before he even expressed them. Leah's brutal honesty was both painful and refreshing. "You're right," he said finally, and the admission seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I do have power over you, and that makes everything happening between us problematic. But I swear to you, Leah, when I started talking to you, it wasn't about power. It was about loneliness." She studied him for a moment, searching for signs of manipulation on his face. Edward Van Arden was known for his negotiation skills, his ability to convince people to do what he wanted, but there was something in his eyes at that moment that seemed too genuine to be a performance. "Loneliness," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "Yes. You talked about New York being too heavy sometimes, remember? For me, it's heavy. Every night. I'm 42. I control an empire that never stops growing. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and I haven't been able to sleep for 2 years. Since Helena died, I feel like a ghost in my own existence." Leah felt something stir in her chest. She knew that kind of loneliness, the kind that made you feel invisible even in the middle of a crowd, but she fought against the compassion that threatened to soften her anger. "That doesn't justify you lying to me," she said. "You made me believe we were equals. In a way, two people getting to know each other genuinely." "We are equals," Edward said, with an intensity that surprised her. "Not financially, obviously, but in what matters, in the way you look at the city down there as if you're searching for something you can't name, in the way you lose yourself in music as if it's the only thing that makes sense, in the way you carry a sadness that I recognize because I see the same thing in the mirror every day." Leah felt tears burning her eyes and blinked them away quickly. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. I know you send half your salary to your grandmother every month, even after everything she put you through. I know you read business books because you dream of having your own company. I know you take 3 subways to get here because you don't want to spend money on a cab. But you buy expensive coffee on Friday mornings because you allow yourself that small luxury once a week." Each word was like a slap in the face to Leah. "How do you know that? Did you investigate me? Did you invade? My privacy?" Edward hesitated, and she saw the answer in his eyes before he could speak. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You investigated me. How long were you watching me before you approached me?" "Leah." "How long, Edward?" He sighed, running his hands through his hair. 6 months. The number fell between them like a bomb. 6 months. Half a year of her life being observed, analyzed, catalogued like a specimen. Leah felt sick. "I need to go," she said, starting to back away. "Wait." Edward followed her but kept a safe distance. "I know it sounds terrible, but it wasn't like that. I didn't plan any of this. I couldn't stop noticing you." "Couldn't stop noticing me," she repeated with a bitter laugh, "as if I were an interesting painting on the wall. That's not it. You don't understand. Then help me understand." Leah turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Explain to me how a man who can have any woman in the country becomes fixated on a cleaning lady who didn't even know he existed." Edward was silent for a moment, struggling to find words that could explain the inexplicable. "You remind me what it was like to feel something real," he said finally. "The first time I saw you, you were cleaning a conference room, but you stopped to look out the window. You stood there for 5 minutes just looking at the city, and there was something on your face. It was like you were seeing possibilities where I only see concrete and glass. It was the first time in 2 years I felt the urge to see the world through someone else's eyes." The words touched something deep in Leah, but she forced herself to keep her defenses up. "And then you decided to manipulate me to get what you wanted. It wasn't manipulation. The promotion was real. You deserved it." "The promotion you orchestrated specifically to get access to me," she interrupted. "Edward, don't you see the problem with that? You have so much power over my life that you can change my entire reality with a phone call. How can I trust anything you say when you literally control my livelihood?" Edward felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had built his entire life around control, the ability to shape circumstances to achieve his goals. But now he realized how that sounded to someone on the other side of the equation. "You're right," he said. "I behaved badly. I used my position in a way that violated your autonomy, even if that wasn't my intention. But Leah, what I felt these past few weeks talking to you, that was real. The moments we spent together were real." "How can I know that?" Her voice was tired now, as if all the adrenaline from the discovery was dissipating, leaving only exhaustion. "How can I distinguish what was real from what was you using privileged information to emotionally manipulate me?" Edward had no answer for that, at least not one he could give at that moment, in that hallway, with the full weight of the truth between them, like a third presence. "I don't know how to prove it to you," he said, "but I know that when you smiled at me that first night, it was the first time in 2 years I felt my heart beat differently, and I know that when you talked about your dreams, I wanted to be a part of them, not to control them, but to support them. Leah looked at him for a long moment, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to get lost in the fantasy that a love like that could really exist. But the part that had learned to survive, the part that bore scars from every betrayal and abandonment, screamed at her to run. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think about all this." "How much time do you need?" "I don't know. Maybe forever." Edward felt the words like a punch to the gut, but he nodded. "I understand. And Leah, your position in the company, your job, that's not at risk. Regardless of what happens between us, it won't affect your work." She almost smiled at the irony. "You see, even now you're using your power to try to reassure me. You can't relate to me without this power dynamic in the middle." Edward opened his mouth to protest, but realized she was right again. Even his attempts to be kind were tinged with the reality of who he was and what he controlled. "I'll find a way to prove my feelings are real," he said. "I don't know how yet, but I will." Leah studied him for another moment, then nodded and walked away toward the elevators. Edward stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of her footsteps echoing on the marble floor, feeling as if an essential part of himself were walking away with her. In the days that followed, Edward found himself in uncharted territory. For the first time in his adult life, there was something he desperately wanted, but couldn't simply buy or acquire through negotiation. Leah had created an impeccable professional distance. She performed her duties efficiently, but avoided any interaction that wasn't strictly necessary. When he tried to prolong work conversations, she responded politely but coldly, making it clear that the bridge between them had been burned. Edward began to notice details about her that had previously gone unnoticed. The way she lit up when talking to other employees, especially Marina, an administrative assistant who had become her friend. How she laughed genuinely when she was relaxed, a sound he realized he had never heard directed at him. How she brightened when talking about the night classes she had started attending. It was Marina who inadvertently gave him a clue about Leah's thoughts. Edward was passing by the cafeteria when he overheard the two of them talking at a nearby table. "I just don't get rich men," Leah was saying. "They live in a bubble where they think everything can be solved with money or power. They can't conceive that some things have to be earned genuinely." "Not all of them are like that," Marina replied. "My brother works for a businessman who's a good guy." "Maybe. But how do you tell the difference between genuineness and performance when the person has the resources to create any reality they want? It's like trying to tell a dream from reality when you don't even know if you're asleep anymore." Edward walked away before they could see him, but Leah's words echoed in his mind. She was right. How could he prove authenticity when his entire world was built on the ability to shape circumstances? The answer came during a meeting with Dr. Spencer, 2 weeks after the confrontation in the hallway. Edward had sought out the psychiatrist in a moment of desperation, needing to talk to someone about the situation with Leah. "You're behaving obsessively," Miles said, his voice maintaining its usual neutral tone. "Just as you did with Helena in the months before she died." "This is different," Edward protested. "Is it? Or are you transferring your previous fixation onto a new object?" Miles leaned forward, his fingers interlaced. "Edward, have you considered that perhaps your attraction to this employee has less to do with her specifically and more with your inability to process Helena's death? Leah is not a substitute for Helena. They are completely different." "Different how?" Edward hesitated. "Helena was fragile, dependent. Leah is strong, independent. Helena was born into the same world as me, never had to fight for anything. Leah has earned everything she has. And that makes her more attractive to you. It makes her real." The word came out of Edward like a confession. Helena lived in a reality built by other people. Leah builds her own reality, brick by brick. Miles made some notes. "And how do you plan to win over someone who builds her own reality, especially when you represent everything she's fighting against?" The question stayed with Edward long after the session ended. How do you win someone over without using the resources you've always relied on? How do you relate as an equal to someone when the entire social structure is against it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Leah had left a book in the conference room where she had been working that afternoon. Edward found it during one of his nightly walks through the empty corridors. It was a worn copy of The Art of War by Sun Tzu, with handwritten notes in the margins. Edward flipped through the book quickly, noticing how she had underlined strategies on how to win when you are the weaker side. One note caught his attention. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This means that true strength comes from understanding your opponent better than they understand themselves. In that moment, Edward understood. Leah wasn't just smart. She was studying, preparing for a world where she would have to compete with people like him. She didn't see relationships as romantic conquests, but as battlefields where she needed to protect her independence. Edward left the book where it was, but an idea began to form in his mind. If he wanted to prove his feelings were genuine, he needed to do something. That would cost him but not directly benefit her. He needed to make himself vulnerable in a way that couldn't be interpreted as manipulation, and he knew exactly what to do. Edward's decision was radical and impulsive, the kind of move his business consultants would call professional suicide. He called a press conference for the next morning, without telling anyone about the content. When reporters from the country's major financial newspapers gathered in the Van Arden Group's auditorium, they were perhaps expecting the announcement of a new acquisition or a strategic partnership. What they got was a public confession that shook the American corporate world. 2 years ago, my wife Helena committed suicide by jumping from the balcony of this very penthouse where I work every day, Edward began, his voice echoing through the silent auditorium. What was not made public at the time was that our marriage had been in crisis for years. Helena suffered from severe depression and bipolar disorder, conditions that I, in my arrogance, believed I could solve with love and financial resources. Leah watched the live broadcast on her phone, hidden in one of the conference rooms on the 28th floor. Her heart pounded when she saw Edward on the screen, standing behind the podium with a vulnerability she never imagined he was capable of showing publicly. I failed as a husband, Edward continued, not because I didn't love her, but because I loved her in the wrong way. I tried to solve her problems as if they were contracts to be negotiated, as if happiness was something that could be acquired through the right connections and the most expensive treatment. In trying to control her illness, I ended up trying to control her too. The murmurs from the reporters grew louder. This kind of transparency was unprecedented from Edward Van Arden, known for his almost pathological privacy. I'm talking about this publicly because I've recently learned that I still have controlling tendencies that affect the people around me, he said, and Leah felt as if he were looking directly at her through the screen. Sometimes when we want something very intensely, we use the resources we have to get it, even if it violates the other person's autonomy. It's a form of violence disguised as care. The questions came in a flood. Why was he revealing this now? Were there new developments in Helena's death? Edward answered some with diplomatic vagueness, but when a reporter asked if he was romantically involved with someone new, his answer was direct. I've recently become interested in someone, he said, and in trying to get closer to this person, I made the same mistakes I made with Helena. I used my position to create opportunities, invaded privacy, manipulated circumstances, and when this person confronted me about my behavior, I realized I hadn't learned anything from the tragedy that destroyed my first marriage. Leah felt tears burning her eyes. He was exposing himself in a way that would cost him dearly. The Van Arden Group's stock had already plummeted 15% before the press conference even ended. Investors hated uncertainty, and Edward had just presented himself as an emotionally unstable man who mixed his personal life with business. The person I'm interested in told me something I can't forget, Edward went on. She asked me how she could distinguish genuineness from performance when I have the resources to create any reality I want. It was the smartest question anyone has asked me in years and also the most humbling, because the honest answer is that she can't. Not as long as I hold this position of absolute power over her life. What he said next left even Leah in shock. Therefore, I am announcing that I will be temporarily stepping down as CEO of the Van Arden Group for the next 6 months. My cousin, Helena Martin, who has a master's in business from Harvard and has been with the company for 5 years, will take over as interim CEO. The auditorium erupted in shouted questions. Edward raised a hand for silence. I can't prove my feelings while I hold power over the circumstances, so I'm giving up that power temporarily to see if what I feel survives outside of it. If this person still wants to know me when I'm just Edward, and not Edward Van Arden of the Van Arden Group, then maybe we can build something real. Leah turned off her phone, her hands trembling. He had just put his reputation, his company, and his fortune at risk for her. It was the most romantic and most terrifying gesture anyone had ever made for her. 2 hours later, Edward appeared at the door of the room where she was working. There was no surprise this time. She had been expecting him. "You've gone completely insane," was the first thing she said. "Probably," he agreed, leaning against the doorframe. "The stock is down 15%. 3 investors have already called demanding emergency meetings, and my assistant has received 52 calls from journalists in the last hour. And yet you're here. Especially because of that, I'm here." Edward entered the room and closed the door behind him. "Leah, I needed you to know that this isn't a game for me. What I feel for you isn't Billionaire's boredom or a savior complex. It's the first real thing I've felt in years." Leah studied him. He seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of the power he had carried for so long had been lifted from his shoulders. There was something almost fragile in the way he looked at her, waiting for her reaction. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. "Why expose yourself like that?" "Because you were right. I couldn't prove my feelings were genuine while I held power over you. So, I decided to take that power out of the equation. Temporarily," she reminded him. "Long enough to prove my point. And if during these 6 months you decide you want nothing to do with me, I'll accept that. But at least you'll know I'd risk everything for you." Leah felt something move in her chest, an emotion she had been fighting to suppress for weeks. "Edward, that was incredibly stupid. And also incredibly romantic." She almost smiled. Maybe a little. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't charged with tension or misunderstanding, but with possibility. For the first time since she had discovered who he really was, Leah could imagine a conversation between them that wasn't overshadowed by the power dynamic. "I still don't know if I can trust you," she said honestly, "but I'd like to try to find out." Edward felt as if he could breathe for the first time in weeks. "What does that mean?" "It means maybe we can try to get to know each other for real this time. No lies, no omissions, no you orchestrating circumstances." She hesitated. "But there's one condition." "Anything." "I want to know everything about Helena, about how she died, about your marriage, about why you believe you failed her. If we're going to try anything, I need to understand your ghosts." Edward felt a cold knot in his stomach. "Leah, it's complicated. It's precisely because it's complicated that I need to know. Edward, you said you became interested in me because I remind you what it's like to feel something real. But how can I be sure I'm not just an attempt to rewrite your history with Helena?" The question hit Edward like a lightning bolt, mainly because he had asked himself the same thing more than once. "You're right. You deserve to know about her." "Then tell me." Edward sat in the chair next to the desk, where Leah worked, as if he needed to brace himself for what was to come. "Helena and I met in college. She was studying fine arts. I was in business school. She was luminous. She had this infectious laugh and a way of seeing beauty in everything. She painted abstract canvases that I never fully understood, but that made me feel things I couldn't name." Leah listened in silence, watching the pain etch itself onto his face. "We married young, maybe too young. The first few years were good. She painted, I built the company, we planned a family, but then she started having episodes, deep depressions that lasted for weeks, followed by periods of manic euphoria where she wouldn't sleep for days. It took 2 years to get a correct diagnosis." "Bipolar disorder," Leah said. "Yes, and I didn't know how to handle it. I believed that if I found the best doctors, the best treatments, if I controlled every stressor in her life, she would be okay. But the more I tried to control, the more she rebelled. She started having affairs during her manic episodes, spending sprees, self-destructive behaviors. Edward paused, running his hands over his face. I should have sought help for myself too. I should have understood that I couldn't save her alone. Instead, I became obsessed with monitoring every aspect of her life. I hired people to watch her when I wasn't around. I installed security cameras at home. I controlled her finances, her schedule, her friendships. That must have been terrible for her, Leah said softly. It was. She told me she felt like a prisoner, but I justified it by saying it was to protect her. In my mind, I was being a devoted husband. In reality, I was being a jailer. And Dr. Spencer, was he treating her? Edward nodded. Miles treated her for the last 2 years of her life. He said she was improving, that she had found a balance with the medication. But in the last few weeks before she died, she became strange, paranoid. She said someone was watching her, that she had secrets about the company that could destroy our family. What kind of secrets? I never found out. I thought it was part of the disorder, a psychotic episode. But now, Edward hesitated. Now what? Now I wonder if there was something I didn't see. The night she died, she said strange things. Talked about hidden documents, about people I shouldn't trust. She said she loved me, but that she couldn't live with the weight of what she knew anymore. Edward got up and walked to the window, looking down at the city below. When they found her the next morning, there was a letter. It said she could no longer distinguish reality from paranoia, that she'd rather die than go completely insane. But there was a line at the end I never understood. The girls from the country know the truth that the city girls prefer to forget. Leah felt a chill run down her spine. The girls from the country. Yes. I never understood what it meant. Helena was born and raised in New York. She had no connection to the country. Edward turned to Leah. But you do. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. There was more to Helena's story than Edward knew, and somehow it connected to Leah's past. Edward, she said slowly, how did you say you found out about my history? How did you know about my mother and grandmother? Routine HR background. Check, why? Because I never told anyone at the company details about my family. I just said I was from rural Ohio. Leah felt her heart race. What's the full name of your private investigator, the one who collected information on me? Edward frowned. I didn't hire an investigator. I asked HR to check your background when I decided to promote you. A pause. Why? Because someone investigated my family very deeply, someone who knew exactly where to look, who had access to records that aren't public. Leah's voice was tense. Edward, what if you weren't the first person to take an interest in me? What if my being hired to work here wasn't a coincidence? The possibility dropped between them like a bomb. Edward felt the ground shift beneath his feet for the second time in a few short weeks. Are you suggesting someone manipulated me in the same way I tried to manipulate you? He asked. I'm suggesting that maybe you're not the only one here with obsessions, Leah said, and that maybe Helena's death had less to do with suicide and more to do with what she discovered about those obsessions. Edward looked at her for a long moment, seeing the sharp intelligence shining in her eyes, the way she was connecting dots he didn't even know existed, and he realized he had fallen in love not just with her beauty or her strength, but with exactly that, her ability to see truths that others couldn't. What do you propose we do? He asked. First, we need to find out who really brought me here, and why. Leah stood up, a new determination shining in her eyes. Second, we need to find out what Helena really knew. And third, we need to be very careful because if someone was able to orchestrate your wife's death and still make you believe it was a suicide, then that person is far more dangerous than we can imagine. Edward nodded, feeling a mix of fear and admiration. In a matter of minutes, Leah had turned his vulnerable confession into a plan of action. She wasn't just the woman he had fallen in love with. She might be the key to solving the mystery that had tormented him for 2 years. And for the first time since Helena's death, Edward felt that he might find not just love, but redemption as well. The investigation began that same night. Edward and Leah met in the penthouse after the building had emptied, turning the executive office into a makeshift command center. It was the first time Leah had set foot in Edward's personal space, and she couldn't help but notice how the environment reflected his personality. Elegant but cold, organized to an extreme, with a spectacular view of the city that somehow felt more like a display case than a window to the world. "Let's start with the hiring records," Edward said, turning on his personal computer. "Every hiring process in the company goes through a detailed analysis. If someone manipulated your hiring, they left a trail." Leah sat beside him, consciously keeping a safe distance. The physical proximity to Edward still made her nervous, not out of fear, but because of the intensity of the attraction she felt and was trying to keep under control. She could smell the subtle cologne he wore, observe the concentration on his face as he navigated the corporate files. "Here," he said after a few minutes. "Your application was recommended through the company's social responsibility program. Apparently you applied through an NGO called Women in Transition, which helps young women from rural areas find work in New York." "That's strange," Leah said, frowning. "I never applied to any program. I got this job through an ad in the paper." Edward and she looked at each other. "Someone forged an application in your name," he said. "The question is, how did this person get enough detailed information about you to create a convincing application?" They spent the next 2 hours investigating the NGO. What they discovered was disturbing. Women in Transition existed on paper, but it was basically a front company. It had a registered address at a business center that rented virtual office spaces, a professional but generic website, and only one listed employee, Marina Spencer. "Spencer," Leah repeated. "Like Dr. Miles Spencer?" "It must be a coincidence," Edward said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. "Spencer is a very common last name. Edward, in my experience, there are no coincidences, only patterns we haven't understood yet." Leah took his phone. "Let me make a few calls. I have some friends who work with real NGOs. They can help me find out more about this organization." While Leah worked her contacts, Edward focused on Helena's personal files. He had avoided going through her things for 2 years, but now he forced himself to open the boxes he kept stored in a locked closet in the penthouse. The discoveries were devastating. Among Helena's belongings, Edward found a phone he didn't recognize, hidden inside a jewelry box. When he managed to unlock it using her birth date, he discovered a series of messages exchanged with an unidentified number. The messages dated from the last 3 months of Helena's life and painted a very different picture from what Edward had imagined. His wife hadn't been paranoid for no reason. She was being blackmailed. "You can't tell him about the girls," one of the messages read. "You know what happened to the last one who tried to talk. Do you want to end up like Mary Ann?" Edward felt his blood run cold. Mary Ann, the same name Leah had mentioned as her mother's. "Leah," he called out, his voice tense. "You need to see this." She came over and read the messages over his shoulder. Edward felt her body tense when she saw her mother's name. "That's not possible," she whispered. "My mother never left Ohio. How could she be connected to Helena?" "I don't know, but these messages suggest your mother knew something, and that it led to—" "What happened to her?" Leah stepped back, running her hands through her hair. "Edward, my mother isn't dead. She's been in a psychiatric hospital for 15 years. "Since when?" "Since I was 8. Leah stopped, a look of horror spreading across her face. "Edward, how far is rural Ohio from New York? How many hours by car?" "About 6 hours. Why?" "Because I'm starting to think my mother made those trips, and I'm starting to understand why my grandmother was always so obsessed with keeping me away from men." Leah sank heavily into an armchair. "She always said men were dangerous, that they used women and then threw them away. I thought it was religious paranoia, but what if it was based on something real?" Edward continued reading the messages on Helena's phone. The pattern that emerged was terrifying. Apparently, Helena had discovered something about a scheme involving young women from the country, something that had been going on for years and had direct connections to people close to Edward. One of the last messages was particularly shocking. "If you tell Edward about Dr. Spencer and the girls he brought for the special treatments, you'll end up like your predecessor, and your family will pay the price." "Dr. Spencer," Edward repeated, feeling sick. "Miles is involved in this." "Not just involved," Leah said, her voice cold. "From what I'm gathering from these messages, he's the orchestrator. He brought girls from the country, vulnerable girls, without strong family support, to New York, supposedly for social programs. But in reality, they were being exploited in some way," Edward finished. "And when they tried to speak up or threatened to expose the scheme, they were silenced. Like my mother was silenced, like Helena was silenced." Leah stood up, starting to pace. "Edward, what if my hiring wasn't just to get you interested in me? What if it was to bring me close to Dr. Spencer, so he could monitor me, make sure I didn't find out about my mother?" Edward felt as if the floor was opening up beneath him. "Leah, that would mean that you were manipulated from the very beginning, that your interest in me was induced, that they used you to bring me exactly where they wanted me." Her voice was trembling, not with fear, but with rage. "And it would mean that Helena found out about all of this and was murdered because of it." The silence that followed was heavy. Edward got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. For 2 years, he had tortured himself, believing he had failed as a husband, that his control issues had driven Helena to suicide. To discover that she might have been murdered was both a relief and a new kind of horror. "If this is true," he said finally, "then we're in danger. Both of us." "No." Leah joined him at the window. "Edward, I need to tell you something. Ever since I started working here, I've had the feeling I was being watched. Initially, I thought it was you, through the security cameras. But now you think it's Miles, or someone working for him." She hesitated. "Edward, do you trust me?" "Completely. Why?" "Because I have a plan, but it's dangerous, and it will require both of us to act as if we know nothing." Leah turned to him. "I need you to schedule a session with Dr. Spencer, and I need you to take me with you." "Absolutely not. If our theory is correct, you'd be putting yourself directly in his line of fire." "Edward, he's already watching me. The difference is that now we know it." Leah took his hands, and Edward felt an electric current run up his arms at the contact. "If we want to find out the truth about Helena, about my mother, about how many other girls were hurt, we need evidence, and the only way to get that evidence is to make him feel safe enough to expose himself." Edward looked into her eyes and saw a fierce determination that left him both proud and terrified. "Leah, I can't lose you too. Not when I've just found you." The confession slipped out of him unplanned, laden with a vulnerability that surprised them both. Leah felt her heart race, not just because of the words, but because of the way he was looking at her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You won't lose me," she said softly. "But Edward, we have to do this together. We can't let more women go through what my mother went through, what Helena went through." Edward nodded slowly. "All right, but we do it my way. I'll schedule the session, but you'll be wearing a wire and we'll have backup." "What kind of backup?" "My cousin, Helena Martin, who's now running the company. She's a trained lawyer and has contacts in the NYPD. If anything goes wrong, she'll know how to act." They spent the next hour planning every detail. Edward would schedule an emergency session with Miles, claiming he was having emotional difficulties since stepping down from the company. He would bring Leah as his girlfriend, saying she was helping him cope. During the session, they would try to get Miles to reveal himself. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had. "Edward," Leah said when they finished planning, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Anything." "Your feelings for me. Even knowing our initial connection might have been manipulated, even discovering that maybe you became interested in me because someone wanted you to. Does that change anything?" Edward studied her for a long moment. She was standing just inches from him, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. He could see the fear in her eyes, not physical fear, but the fear that his answer would diminish what was growing between them. "Leah, even if Miles orchestrated our first meeting, he couldn't manufacture what I feel when I'm with you. He couldn't create the way you challenge me, the way you make me want to be better, the way you make me feel hope for the first time in years." Edward took her face in his hands. "Maybe he planted the seed, but what grew is ours." Leah felt tears burning her eyes. "How can you be sure?" "Because what I feel for you is completely different from what I felt for Helena. I loved Helena by trying to protect her from the world. But with you, I want to face the world by your side." The words touched something deep in Leah, breaking down the final barriers she had built around her heart. She moved closer, rising on her tiptoes, and kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if they were both testing the reality of what they felt. But then it deepened, charged with weeks of repressed tension, fear, desire, and the relief of finally being able to connect without the shadow of lies between them. When they broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. "Edward," Leah said, resting her forehead against his, "I'm falling in love with you, and it terrifies me, because I've never let myself feel anything like this before." "Why does it terrify you?" "Because it means I have something to lose, and in my experience, when you have something to lose, you always end up losing it." Edward held her face more firmly. "Not this time. This time we're going to fight for what we have, together." Leah nodded, and, for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something good, something real, something lasting. They didn't know that, 40 floors below, Dr. Miles Spencer was watching the building from his car, a cold smile playing on his lips. The plan was working better than he had expected. Edward and Leah were exactly where he wanted them, and tomorrow, when they came for the session, he could finally close the circle he had started drawing 15 years ago, when a young woman from rural Ohio had discovered secrets she shouldn't have. The only difference was that this time, he wouldn't make the mistake of leaving any living witnesses. The next morning broke grey over New York as Edward and Leah made their way to Dr. Miles Spencer's office. The medical building was in Midtown East, a modern mirrored glass structure that reflected the heavy clouds like a dark omen. Leah wore a micro-recorder disguised as a pendant, a gift from Helena Martin, who had spent the night preparing legal documents and coordinating with contacts in the NYPD. "Remember," Edward said as they rode the elevator up, "let me lead the conversation at first. Only step in when you feel the time is right." Leah nodded, but inside her heart was beating like a war drum. During the night, she had called her grandmother in Ohio, feigning a casual conversation but asking specific questions about the period before her mother's institutionalization. The answers had confirmed her worst suspicions. Mary Ann had made regular trips to New York in the months before she was committed, always returning more agitated and paranoid. Miles's office was exactly what one would expect from an elite psychiatrist. Italian leather sofas, framed diplomas covering the walls, a panoramic view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. But there was something in the air that made Leah uneasy, a predatory energy disguised as professionalism. At 50, Dr. Miles Spencer still maintained the impeccable appearance he had cultivated for decades. Perfectly coiffed grey hair, a tailored suit, a controlled smile that never reached his eyes. When Edward and Leah entered, he greeted them with the studied cordiality of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of making people feel at ease while collecting information about them. "Edward, good to see you," Miles said, shaking his hand with unnecessary force. "And this must be the young woman who caused all that commotion in the press." "Dr. Spencer, this is Leah," Edward said, carefully watching the psychiatrist's reaction as he took her hand. "A pleasure, Leah." Miles held her hand a few seconds longer than necessary, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You remind me of someone I met a long time ago, a very beautiful woman as well." The seemingly innocent comment confirmed Leah's suspicions. He recognized the family resemblance. He had really known her mother. "Edward tells me you're facing some challenges in your relationship," Miles continued, gesturing for them to sit, "especially related to his past with Helena." "It's complicated," Edward said, following the script they had rehearsed. "Ever since I started my relationship with Leah, I've been having disturbing dreams about Helena, as if she's trying to tell me something." Miles leaned forward, interested. "What kind of dreams?" "She appears, talking about secrets, about things she discovered before she died, about people I should distrust." Edward paused deliberately. And about girls from the country. Leah saw a dangerous glint flash in Miles's eyes, too quick to be her imagination. Interesting, the psychiatrist said, making notes. And you, Leah, how does it feel to be compared to a dead woman? The question was a trap, and Leah knew it. Actually, Dr. Spencer, I'm curious about Helena. Edward told me she talked a lot about girls from the country before she died. It's strange because I'm from rural Ohio, and my family went through some difficulties when I was a child. What kind of difficulties? My mother had a nervous breakdown when I was 8. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital and never left. Leah kept her voice neutral, casual. Her name is Mary Ann. Oliver? Perhaps you know her. I know you worked on similar cases a long time ago. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Miles stopped writing and stared at Leah, as if re-evaluating an equation he thought he had solved. Mary Ann, he repeated slowly. That's a common name in the country. Not that common, Leah said, especially not for a woman who made regular trips to New York before being committed. Trips she never explained to her family. Edward felt the tension in the air shift. It was like watching two predators circle each other, testing their strength before the attack. You've done some very detailed research on your family, Miles said, and for the first time since they arrived, his voice lost its friendly, professional tone. It's impressive how stubborn some people are about uncovering truths that are better left buried. Was Helena stubborn? Edward asked. Miles turned to him with a smile that no longer hid the coldness behind it. Helena was a disturbed woman, Edward. Her bipolar disorder made her see conspiracies where none existed, create fanciful connections between unrelated events. Like the connection between you and Mary Ann? Leah asked directly. Miles's mask finally dropped completely. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced, and looked at them with an expression that mixed amusement and menace. You two really think you're clever, don't you? He said. Especially you, Leah. So much like your mother in your self-destructive stubbornness. Edward felt his muscles tense. So you did know her? Of course I knew Mary Ann. She was part of a very special program I ran for years, a study on the adaptation of rural youths to the urban environment. Miles stood and walked to the window. I brought girls from the country, always the prettiest, the most vulnerable, to New York supposedly for professional training programs. But in reality, Leah asked, though she already knew the answer. In reality, they participated in experimental sessions, alternative therapies. Some very powerful men in the city had specific needs that traditional medicine couldn't address. Miles turned to them with a cold smile. Your mother was particularly useful for almost 2 years, until she decided she had discovered too much. Edward felt sick to his stomach. You prostituted her. I offered a highly specialized therapeutic service. Some clients paid extraordinary sums for sessions that helped with their own psychological issues. Miles returned to his chair. Mary Ann never understood the importance of what she was doing. When she started asking questions, wanting to know the names of other clients, she became a problem. So you drove her insane, Leah said, rage boiling in her voice. I helped her find peace. A specific combination of drugs that induced a permanent psychotic state, much more humane than simply eliminating her. Miles picked up a pen from his desk, toying with it casually. And it worked perfectly for 15 years until you decided to come to New York. You brought me here, Leah said. You orchestrated my hiring. Obviously. When I found out Mary Ann's daughter had moved to New York, I needed to bring her close where I could monitor her. And what better way than to make Edward fall in love with you? Miles smiled. It was almost poetic. Edward has always been easy to manipulate emotionally. His savior complex makes him predictable. Edward stood up, his fists clenched. You killed Helena. Helena found out about the program. She started asking the same inconvenient questions Mary Ann had. And unlike your mother, Helena had resources and connections that could cause real trouble. Miles sighed as if discussing something tedious. The suicide was much more elegant than an accident, and you, Edward, were so helpful in providing all the evidence of a troubled marriage and an unstable wife. Leah rose slowly, her blood boiling. How many women have you hurt over all these years? I've helped dozens of young women find their purpose in life. Some, like your mother, had difficulty accepting that purpose. Others were more collaborative. Miles opened a desk drawer. And you, my dear, will have the same choice your mother had. His hand emerged from the drawer holding a syringe. We can do this, the easy way or the hard way. The same combination of drugs that pacified Mary Ann will work perfectly on you. Edward will be told you had a nervous breakdown, just like your mother. History repeating itself. Edward moved to stand between Miles and Leah, but the psychiatrist raised the syringe threateningly. I wouldn't do that, Edward. This is a very powerful sedative mixed with hallucinogens. 1 dose would be enough to cause permanent brain damage. 2 doses would be fatal. You're not getting away with this, Leah said. We have evidence. Miles laughed. Evidence? You have the conspiracy theories of a paranoid cleaning lady and an emotionally unstable billionaire. Against the word of a respected psychiatrist with 30 years of an impeccable career. But before he could move toward them, the office door burst open. Helena Martin entered, followed by 2 NYPD detectives and a technical team. Dr. Miles Spencer, you're under arrest, one of the detectives said, on suspicion of homicide, human trafficking, rape, and extortion. Miles looked at the syringe in his hand, then at Edward and Leah, finally understanding he had been outplayed. You recorded everything, he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Every word, Helena Martin confirmed, holding up a tablet where a live feed of the conversation was still being recorded. We have teams simultaneously arresting every man on your client list. The operation is happening all over the city. During the chaotic minutes that followed, as Miles was handcuffed and led away, Edward and Leah held each other, trembling with adrenaline and relief. It's over, Edward whispered in her ear. It's finally over. But Leah knew it wasn't really over. There was still so much to process, so much to heal. They had found the truth, but the truth was only the first step. Edward, she said, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. Now that we know the whole truth about how we met, about why I ended up in your life, how do we move on from here? Edward took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. We move on by choosing to be together, not because of manipulations or orchestrated circumstances, but because we decide that what we have is worth fighting to preserve. What if we find out our feelings were influenced from the start? Then we'll find out together, and if we have to, we'll fall in love all over again, this time by our own choice with no outside influence. Edward smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a completely genuine smile. Leah, I choose you. Not because someone manipulated me into choosing you, but because after really getting to know you, I discovered you're the bravest, smartest, and strongest person I've ever met. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve your love. Leah felt tears stream down her face, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope, of love. I choose you too, Edward. Despite everything, because of everything, I choose you. They kissed right there, in the middle of the chaos of the office being turned into a crime scene, sealing a promise born from trauma and conspiracy, but which had grown into something genuine and strong. Outside, New York carried on with its frantic routine, unaware that 2 lives had been transformed, that a decades-old scheme had been dismantled, that justice had finally come for women who had suffered in silence for years. But for Edward and Leah, the world had shrunk. To that moment, that choice, that love they had decided to build together, stone by stone, truth by truth, scar by scar. It was only the beginning. 6 months later, Edward stood on the porch of the beach house he had bought in the Hamptons, watching Leah walk along the wet sand. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, creating a scene that seemed to be from a dream, but was now part of their daily reality. They had left New York shortly after Miles's trial, needing time and space to rebuild their lives away from the city's painful memories. The trial had been a national spectacle. Miles Spencer was sentenced to 45 years in prison for multiple crimes, including homicide, human trafficking, rape, and racketeering. 23 influential New York men were also arrested, including businessmen, politicians, and other professionals who had participated in Miles's program. The scandal shook the city's elite and led to significant reforms in laws protecting vulnerable women. But for Edward and Leah, the real victory had been more personal. Mary Ann, after 15 years in an institution, had begun to respond positively to new treatments once the drugs Miles had used to keep her sedated were finally identified and discontinued. She still had a long road ahead, but doctors were optimistic about her gradual recovery. The first time Leah visited her mother in the hospital, 3 months after Miles's arrest, had been both devastating and liberating. Mary Ann, though still confused and frail, recognized her daughter. Her first coherent words in 15 years were, "You grew up so beautiful, my love. I knew you'd be strong." Edward had accompanied Leah on that visit and all the subsequent ones, never trying to push or rush the process, just offering silent support. It was in those hospital corridors that Leah finally understood what it meant to have a true partner. Someone who didn't try to solve her problems for her, but who stood by her side as she solved them herself. The Van Arden Group had thrived under the leadership of Helena Martin, who proved to be an even more visionary executive than Edward. When he officially stepped down from the CEO position to devote more time to his personal life, the company's stock reached record highs. Edward retained a majority stake, but now worked as a strategic consultant, allowing him the flexibility to be present for the things that truly mattered. Leah had gone back to school, studying business administration at Stony Brook University, commuting from the Hamptons for her classes. Edward offered to pay for her education, but she insisted on doing it with her own resources, a scholarship she earned through academic merit, and an internship at a social consulting firm that helped NGOs become more professional. It was work that fulfilled her, that gave purpose to her painful experiences. "What are you thinking about?" Leah asked, stepping onto the porch with her feet still sandy. "About how we got here," Edward replied, pulling her close on the wooden bench they had installed to watch the sunsets. "A year ago, I was a bitter man living like a ghost in my own life. You were a fighter trying to build your independence in the big city. Neither of us imagined our stories would intersect like this." Leah snuggled against his chest, the scent of the sea and his cologne mingling in the humid evening air. "Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if we hadn't found out about Miles, if we had just moved on without investigating." "Do you really wonder that?" "No," she admitted, smiling. "I could never live with unresolved questions, and neither could you. We're both too obsessed with the truth to pretend everything was fine." Edward laughed, kissing the top of her head. "It's one of the things I love most about you, that inability to settle for superficial answers." During their months in the Hamptons, they had learned to live together in a way neither had experienced before. Edward discovered he could be happy without controlling every aspect of his environment. Leah discovered she could trust someone without losing her independence. They developed simple routines that became precious. Morning walks on the beach, long breakfasts on the porch, evenings reading together in the hammock Edward had hung between 2 palm trees in the yard. It wasn't always easy. There were nights Leah woke up from nightmares about Miles, and Edward held her while she cried. There were days Edward was consumed by guilt about Helena, questioning signs he should have seen, and Leah patiently reminded him he wasn't responsible for the actions of a psychopath. They went to therapy individually and as a couple, with a psychologist who helped them process their trauma and build healthy communication. "Edward," Leah said, pulling back slightly to look into his eyes, "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made his heart race. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay." She smiled, a grin that lit up her entire face. "I got a job offer today." "What kind of offer?" "An international NGO that works to protect vulnerable women. They want to hire me as the regional coordinator for the United States. It would be based in New York, but with travel all over the country." Edward felt a mix of pride and concern. "That's exactly the kind of work you've always wanted to do." "It is. And it's terrifying and exciting at the same time." Leah hesitated. "Edward, if I take this position, it would mean moving back to New York. leaving this peace we've built here. And I know you're still recovering from everything that happened there." Edward was silent for a moment, processing the implications. New York still held painful memories for both of them, but it was also where their professional and family lives were centered. And more importantly, it was where Leah could make the difference she had always dreamed of making. "Do you want to accept?" he asked. "I do, but only if you're with me on this. I don't want to build a career at the expense of our relationship." Edward took her hands in his. "Leah, one of the reasons I fell in love with you was your determination to make a difference in the world. I wouldn't be the man you deserve if I tried to stop you from following your purpose. But what about you? Your life here, the peace we found? My life is wherever you are. And as for peace," Edward smiled, "we don't need a beach house to have peace. We need each other. The rest is just geography." Leah felt tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I want to spend the rest of my life supporting your dreams the same way you've supported my recovery." Edward stood up and knelt before her on the bench. "Actually, since we're talking about changes..." Leah's heart stopped when she saw Edward pull a small velvet box from his pocket. "Leah Oliver," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant engagement ring with a single diamond that caught the sunset light. "Will you marry me?" The tears Leah had been holding back finally spilled over. "Edward, before you answer," he continued, "I need you to know that I'm not asking because I'm afraid of losing you to New York or because I want to tie you down. I'm asking because I want the whole world to know that I chose you and you chose me, despite everything we've been through. I want us to be a family, to face the future together, to build something lasting on top of all the pain we've survived." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." Edward slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. When he stood up to kiss her, Leah threw herself into his arms with such force that she nearly knocked them both over. "I love you," she said between kisses and tears. "I love you so much it sometimes hurts." "I love you too, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They kissed there on the porch, with the sound of the waves breaking on the shore and the sky turning red in the background, knowing they had found something rare and precious, a love that had been born from painful circumstances, but had grown into something genuine and unbreakable. 3 months later, they were married in an intimate ceremony on the beach, with only close family present. Mary Ann, still frail but lucid, was able to attend with a nurse and was the one who walked Leah down the aisle. Helena Martin was the maid of honor, and even Leah's grandmother traveled from Ohio for the occasion. Finally understanding that not all men were dangerous, Edward and Leah moved into an apartment in New York but kept the beach house as a refuge for weekends and holidays. Leah thrived in her new job, traveling the country helping vulnerable women, always with Edward's unconditional support. He became more actively involved with the Van Arden Group again, but now focused the company on social impact investments, especially in programs protecting women and children. 2 years after their wedding, Leah found out she was pregnant. When she told Edward, they were on the porch of the Hamptons' house, on the same bench where he had proposed. The sunset was just as spectacular, as if the universe was celebrating with them. "A girl," the doctor said during the ultrasound, "and she's perfectly healthy." "Helena," Leah said immediately, looking at Edward. "If you agree, I'd like to name our daughter Helena, not in memory of your first wife, but in honor of the cousin who helped us find the truth and each other." Edward nodded, too moved to speak. Helena Van Arden was born on a sunny December morning, with her mother's powerful lungs and her father's determined eyes. When Edward held her for the first time, Leah saw tears streaming down his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking that I finally understand what a real family means," he replied. "Not just people connected by blood or circumstance, but people who choose to stay together, to care for each other, to build something greater than the sum of their parts." Leah smiled, watching her husband cradle their daughter with a tenderness that melted her heart. "And I'm thinking that our daughter will never know the fear I knew. She will grow up knowing she is loved unconditionally, that she has a voice, that she can be anything she wants to be. And she'll grow up knowing the story of how her parents met, Edward said. The true version with all the hard parts included, so she'll understand that sometimes the best things in life grow from the most unlikely places. Years later, when Helena was 5 and running along the beach chasing seagulls, Edward and Leah sat on the same bench where it had all begun, watching her play. "Do you ever regret it?" Leah asked, a question that had become a ritual between them, always with the same answer. "Never," Edward replied, kissing her temple. "Not even the hard times, because they brought us here. And you?" "Never. Even knowing all the pain we would have to face, I would choose you again, 1,000 times over." They sat there in comfortable silence, watching their daughter discover the world with the fearless curiosity she had inherited from her mother and the quiet determination she had inherited from her father. The sun set once again on their lives, painting everything gold, and they knew they had achieved something rare. They had transformed trauma into healing, obsession into true love, lies into a truth that would last forever. Edward Van Arden and Leah Oliver had found each other under the most unlikely circumstances, survived the most devastating revelations, and built a love that was genuine, healthy, and enduring. It was exactly the kind of ending they both deserved, but one neither had dared to believe was possible. And there, on the porch of a beach house with their daughter playing in the sand and the future stretching out before them like an endless shore full of possibilities, they knew that the story that had begun with so much pain had turned into the most beautiful love story of their lives.